Hey there, I'm Nick.
And I'm Lewis.
Welcome to The Collective Cast, a podcast by and for indie app developers.
We're here to have an open and honest conversation about the highs and lows of app development.
Today, we're going to be talking about the difference between Objective-C and Swift and why you would use one versus the other. So, Lewis, what brought this up in my mind was an email I got from a recruiter who not only was asking if I was available for iOS development, but also asking if I had switched all of my app development over to Swift. And it made me wonder how many apps of yours are Objective-C versus Swift and what you think about the whole process.
Okay, well, yeah, it's an interesting question, absolutely. And so in terms of my apps that are in Swift, so I've just finished like a really small app for a charity for a friend of mine, and I've done that entirely in Swift as a kind of learning exercise, really. And beyond that, all of my other apps are in Objective-C, and they maybe have, like, I think now I'm going to do new files and try and do them in Swift, which originally I was against the idea of kind of mixing Objective-C and Swift in the same project. But I've decided that is not going to be productive in the long term, and so I'm going to try and do all new stuff in Swift, but everything else is certainly in Objective-C. How about you? How much have you done any Swift at all?
I've done precious little. I actually did one of those embarrassing tutorials where you buy one of those online courses that kind of like walks you through building a simple app, because I was going to get started doing a game, and I was like, you know what? A game has a custom UI. I can do that in Swift right from the beginning. And it was just like one of those really stupid like pop and lock games. And so I built that completely in Swift using storyboards and all sorts of other things that I normally avoid. But that's been about it. All of my existing apps are Objective-C. And if I'm being honest, I really don't want to migrate them, you know, like I don't really want to spend the time debt to bring them all up to date. But then I'm also obviously worried about the day that Apple deprecates Objective-C and we have to do it anyways.
Well, I mean, for me, I have no plans to bring, but certainly my biggest app, Progress, there's just too much code in there. I just feel like if I move that to Swift, that would just basically be an exercise in creating bugs, like no matter how carefully I did it. And I've thought about bringing my other app in, which is a lot smaller and more manageable. But even then, there's no value to the customer, you know, so it's spending a lot of time and potentially decreasing value to the customer by introducing bugs and nothing for the customer. But I think it definitely is going to be, well, it clearly is the future. In terms of your concern about Apple deprecating it, I don't think I don't know whether I'd say that's never going to happen, but I think that is at least 10 or 20 years away, because so much of, you know, the whole of iOS is written in Objective-C, and that stuff can't just go away. And also all the, you know, like UI kit and all that stuff, even though you can get at that from Swift, those core libraries are going to be accessible from both, you know, forever, presumably. So
Yeah, that is a good point, because that was my main worry. Wasn't really starting new app development in Swift. I agree with you that like the easiest way to get in is to, you know, do like a trial balloon app and then try to have maybe new apps be Swift. But yeah, I was really worried that any of our existing apps, if we'd have to basically like go back to the drawing board, rewrite them completely in Swift, and then the end result is at best your customers notice absolutely no change whatsoever, and you've just invested quite a considerable amount of time for no real benefit.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think now is probably a good time to start, though. Swift seems to have settled down a lot, seems to be much more stable. And when I am using it, I'm finding I really enjoy it. So I've been doing it in the last few days, and then I go back to Objective-C, and it's like, man, this just feels old. Like Objective-C just feels clunky and kind of not nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've noticed like my favorite form of development is just pure web development, where I have brackets open, editing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you know, it doesn't get any more complicated than media queries in CSS and like jQuery. And then I pop back into an iPhone app, and I'm like, my God, what is this madness?
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, yeah, Swift feels very nice. and it's very clean, and it deals with a lot of stuff much better than just I think any other language does. It's thought a lot of stuff through really well, and it's really nice. I think the biggest problem with it for me at the moment is that Xcode doesn't seem to do as good a job with it. So for example, like you kind of, especially when you're learning a new thing, you tend to lean on autocomplete, and how it deals with named parameters and stuff like that I find a bit confusing, and they've changed how that's worked as Swift has evolved, and I'm never it kind of suggests the name of the parameter, but then you're not meant to use it or things like that. I find that is taking a bit of getting used to, but even now after a few days I feel like I'm kind of getting better with that and knowing what to look for.
That's good. That's good. How do you think Swift would stack up for, I guess, what I would call code-driven development, where I'm not the biggest fan in Xcode of using storyboards or any of the visual editors. I've kind of gotten really addicted to doing like just pure code-driven views, so like my view controllers and everything is done purely in code. And I didn't know how that would translate to Swift, or if Swift kind of requires you to use the visual editing tools to craft your views.
No, definitely not. So as Apple's kind of goal with Swift, they said, was for it to be used for anything from a scripting language right through to creating entire operating systems. And so there's a lot of power in there, and everything that you can do. So I mostly use storyboards, but in Swift, I've done like manual auto layout stuff and things like that. And it will all be very familiar because all of the UI kit stuff is the same. So the way you do it is the same, it's just a slightly different syntax. And so I don't think that from that perspective you would have any difficulties at all. And so, yeah, I wouldn't let that put you off. You definitely don't need a storyboard to do it.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Because, yeah, I do feel like, I mean, like with all projects everywhere, getting started is the hardest part. And I just always have that nagging feeling where if you feel like you are, quote, behind on a project and you just want to like get started and write a bunch of code really fast, the thought of doing Swift and meaning I'd have to pause, I'd have to pivot to Stack Overflow a little bit more, was always unappealing. And since there's no impetus to switching to Swift other than being up to date and keeping yourself from being a coding dinosaur. And so I feel like I finally just need to like stop like falling back on that and just be like, okay, pick a really dead simple app and just build it in Swift.
Yeah, I'd say you're right. And I'd say that a lot of the stuff has got a lot better. So if you're stuck on something, if you type, I don't know, NS user default Swift or Swift 3, then you'll find examples really quickly of anything that you're looking for. And it certainly feels like it's getting much more stable and much more accessible. I mean, one thing I would recommend is there's a few podcasts that you can go and listen to, which I've listened to, where they've had people talking about Swift. And so I'll dig out the links and put them in the notes. But there's one on a podcast called Accidental Tech Podcast, and they have a long chat with Chris Lattner, who is basically the main guy behind Swift.
Oh, nice.
And so that is really interesting. It's quite unusual for someone at Apple, especially a technical person at Apple, to come and talk in detail about, stuff behind the scenes. And so that was really interesting to listen to. And then there's another one with, I forgot his name, with Craig Federighi, and he's on the Daring Fireball podcast, and that is really interesting as well. And they talk about how which project. Well, they don't name names, but they say they talk about the level of adoption of Swift within Apple and stuff like that. And so those are pretty interesting things to listen to.
Yeah, I would wonder that too, because I thought it was interesting. That recruiter email I mentioned is actually from a company where it's kind of one of those iOS developers hiring other iOS developers. So I thought it was interesting because it was probably like a metric gather for when they're reaching out to developers, like should they be targeting people who have gone Swift or Swift only, for example, Whereas I remember kind of like an unrelated thought, but way back when I used to do Java development, there were a lot of companies that actually stayed like 2 SDK versions behind, like the equivalent of being like on Windows XP in like 2015, like really far behind, because it meant that most of the bugs were resolved, and even if you didn't have like the newest features from the last few years, it was guaranteed to be stable, for like medical devices and things like that. And so I do wonder, like the similar companies that are risk averse, will they be moving to Swift yet, or will they stay with Objective-C for a few years?
Yeah, I think it will depend on. I think it will be the same for a lot of people. That I can't see that's the sell of converting code old Objective-C code into Swift. I think that's a really tough sell. But I think new code, it's a much easier sell, and the things supposedly it's much safer and memory wise and things like that.
Right. You know what I just realized they might do is at some point, maybe in like 3 or 4 years, they will never break an Objective-C app as long as it's, say, 64-bit compatible. And but maybe you can't submit like new binaries that are built in Objective-C, so that like all of our existing apps will work just fine, but they'll kind of have like an end of life if you don't like rebuild them in Swift. And then that can be kind of like a natural way to like avoid breaking the old stuff but kind of nudge you into the new era.
Yeah, well, I mean, I get out of my depth talking about this stuff, but they already have bytecode, right, which is semi-compiled or whatever, and so what you submit, theoretically, they can post-apply a compiler and make the code that you've submitted be optimized for different architectures and devices and stuff like that. By the time it leaves Xcode, it doesn't matter whether it's come out of Swift or Objective-C. And so I think Objective-C will probably always be an option, but just, there will be new language features in. So in the past, they've been adding new language features to Objective-C, and then more recently that's just been to bring it to parity with Swift, and then in future there will be lots of new language features in Swift, but I think there will be no new language features in Objective-C.
Right. So you mean it'll be more carrot, less stick, like just trying to encourage people to move over to Swift. Like maybe in the iPhone 9, you can't take advantage of some new feature in Objective-C because there's no library for it.
Yeah, honestly, I don't even think that. I think it would just be something like all the threading stuff. If you look at like the syntax for GCD for the like dispatcher in Swift, it looks so much nicer than the really clunky way you do it in Objective-C, and things like that. And I think they can make threading much nicer and easier, and there will just start to be kind of language features where it's just easier to read and easier to write in Swift than it is in Objective-C.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I have noticed a shift maybe in the past 6 months to a year where when I'm using a site like Stack Overflow to find a problem, the first two answers will now be Swift answers, and it's like some kind soul that will put the Objective-C answer in, and inevitably the Swift answer is like, let blah 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 equal this, and it's 2 lines of very natural language writing, and then the Objective-C is like this monstrosity of code just to do something like tell like what camera permissions you have.
Yeah, in summary, I think it's definitely worth looking into, but it's not something. I mean, that's almost the problem, is that because there's no real pressure, it's very easy, and I put it off for at least a year just because there's no need to do it.
Yeah. I'm always aware of not invalidating myself. Like as a developer, we obviously have to keep ourselves up to date, right? Or we risk being, that caricature from like Office Space or something where the old guy who still does Fortran and doesn't understand the newfangled things in the world like mice.
Mm, yeah, well, it's a valid concern, and I think there's other exciting reasons to start doing it though. For example, I don't know how long, but within a few years, you'll be able to write Swift for the server. I mean, technically, I think already you can do that, and so that'll be pretty cool. If you can write your server component in Swift and your iOS app in Swift, and then I could imagine a time where Apple just allow you to use Swift instead of JavaScript in Safari, and then you can imagine getting to the point where Swift is all you need, and that will be a real benefit, just to be able to do everything in Swift. And maybe in the browser is obviously more difficult, but if anyone can do it, Apple can do it. Can kind of force that to happen.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point because I realized now I've only in the past year gotten into really in-depth server components for iPhone apps, and what I've done up to date is I will do like a Rails API built on Heroku, and then you can just do like API calls that send and receive JSON, And it's great because I can have, a web interface and an iPhone app that hit the same API, but I'm obviously writing in multiple languages and I have Xcode open and my backend development open. So if what you're saying is like if there's a future where I build a Swift app and I just switch over to my backend view and I'm writing the same code and then you can do like a one-click deploy still, like that has some serious advantages.
Yeah, and Apple are clearly heavily motivated to do that as well. Like they've got a lot of stuff in their website which is very out of date, and they Swift the only thing apart from Apple, the only stuff that is officially supported for Swift is Linux, and so that's clearly so that you can run this stuff to encourage people to build server-side components. Yeah, it's definitely coming. It's definitely coming.
All right, fine. I'm convinced. The next, I will like put my money where my mouth is. The next app I build for the App Collective, I will build it in Swift, but patrons will have to forgive me because it will be the most simple baby app ever, but it will be done.
Yeah, I think you'll find it easier than you think. You realize how much of what you know about programming for iOS is actually the frameworks and the libraries and things like delegate pattern and all this kind of stuff. There's a lot more. The actual syntax is actually a much smaller component of it. I'm sure it's frustrating when you know how to do it in Objective C and you can't do it in Swift, but those times will be less than you think, I think.
That's true. And I've been a software developer for almost 2 decades and I've learned many languages. So it's not exactly new or revelatory to have to switch over to a new language. I think it's just like you always run that risk of getting too comfortable. Like back in the day, I was very comfortable using Flex. And then once all of Adobe started getting kind of knocked off the internet, then all of a sudden, like, you had to move on to maybe HTML5 and like pure HTML web dev, and it's always hard, but I think it's always better afterwards because you know more. And I always tell younger developers when they ask me questions that it's not about which language you learn first. It's more about learning design paradigms and how to analytically look at problems and creatively figure out solutions, because then you can just learn any language in a couple weeks and apply that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, then, moving on, I believe we have a couple of developer rants in our queue. Did you want to lead us off?
Sure. Well, so my rant it's not exact. It's kind of almost a recovery from a rant and just something to talk through. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts really. So we talked before on a kind of alpha over this podcast about a time app, a world time app that was just at the very end of the scale of despicable apps in the way it works in terms of pestering you and just generally throwing up ads at every opportunity and making kind of actual usage about 5% of the experience, and 95% was you wanting to throw your phone out the window.
Yep.
And so I've after we spoke about that, I kind of vowed to try and move my app a little bit along the scale because that app was making an absolute ton of money, and I was like, can I come somewhere closer to that without becoming that stick of evil? And so what I've done is I've kind of just put up a bit like, have you ever used Sublime Text?
I know of it, but I haven't really used it very much.
Right, and so Sublime is a great text editor, and it is totally free. But every so often they will just pop up a message saying, "Hey, have you thought about actually paying for this?" And so I'm kind of going with the same approach as that, and I have and the bit that I'm most nervous about is that I've put it into the Today widget, and so I'm going to have so the way I'm going to do it is the first X goes, it never nags you, and then after that, it will roll a dice, and the dice will be will be 1 in 30, and if you get the jackpot, it will bring up the message. And I'm kind of quite nervous about putting that in the Today widget because I've never seen anything like that before. But equally, I'm kind of feel like that's probably where a lot of my users are, and they never see the ads and they never see anything.
Right. No, I actually think that it'll be, at the very least, it'll be really fascinating to see how it turns out, because I've noticed that whether it's a podcast I'm listening to, a website that has a membership, or whatever else, wherever you interact with the content is where you kind of need to petition your users to pay. And so if you had something like you said in your widget where it was like, enjoying this widget, love knowing what time it is in Tokyo, how about upgrading to, the pro version or ad free or whatever language you want to use?
Yeah, that's it. And so what I've done is I've started going to start counting how many times the widget has appeared, and so the message is going to be something like, "You've used this widget 37 times. How about giving me some money?" Basically, and then I've got two buttons, and one was it's like a yes and no, and a happy face, like a crying face and a happy face. This is what I've done, and then but because I'm also terrified of people hating me, I'm going to put in something so I can turn it off remotely. So if it starts crashing and burning, I can flick a switch on a server and it will go back to the old non-nagging ways.
That's actually both paranoid and genius, and I kind of wish I had thought of that.
Yeah, well, I've kind of thought about doing something like that for a long time for different things, and just I don't know. I just decided this is the thing I'm so scared of
Right.
that it's driven me to actually do it, and that's turned out to be pretty simple. There's like I found a CocoaPod that lets you basically register use a server to pull NS defaults from, and so you can say, get me my NS defaults from this address, and then it just downloads a plist and stores them in defaults, and it caches it, and I just check if there's nothing, if there's no default, then just basically have it turned off, and then if when the server updates, it will do something different next time.
That's actually kind of amazing, and I'm just going to preemptively say we will mention that in the show notes, because there are so many times where, say I come out with a new version of an app and I've done something different, right? Like you've added a key new feature or something, and sure, I have done things where you show release notes and things like that, but say you wanted to take action exactly once if some circumstance changed from, say, version 3 to 4.
Mm.
If you had the ability to download a remote set of defaults, that would be a really amazing way to achieve that, because you could easily tell, like, oh, I don't have these defaults at all yet, and you don't have to release a new binary to get them.
Yeah, exactly. And so fingers crossed that yeah, we'll see how that comes. Hopefully by the next episode, I'll be able to say how successful or unsuccessful that has been.
That's amazing. Yeah, I'm really excited to hear that, because my high level method of trying to get user feedback and paying for things is something I haven't taken the time to do in any app yet, but it would be something kind of like what you said, where, say, you're on the main screen, maybe you would do an action, add a task, track something, take a photo, whatever the action of the app is. And then maybe like at the bottom or on the side or just somewhere that's not a modal pop-up, it would be like, having a good time, enjoying this app, and be maybe like a thumbs up, thumbs down. And if you hit thumbs up, then you would get a little more bold, and you would say, oh, thanks for that. And then maybe it would be, how about a review in the App Store? Or do you have a comment? Or mind upgrading? But I actually absolutely love your idea of kind of tracking the number of uses. Because say you tracked how long let's say it's a filter app, right? To generate really cool Instagram filters or something like that. You could be like, you've saved 720 photos using this app. How about spending 9 cents per every 100 photos you've taken and give me $1?
Yeah. Well, that's it. That's my hope, is that by making people aware of how much utility they're getting, that it's an encouragement for them to.
Yeah. Actually, also there's a great mapping app called Citymapper that is basically essential if you're in like London, DC, I'm wherever, and it has this really great thing where it'll tell you how long to get somewhere via a fake means. So it'll be like, this is how long it takes on the tube, this is how long it takes on the bus, this is how long it takes if you had a jetpack.
Right.
And I kind of like the idea of, if you had a thing where it was like, you've used this app for 37 minutes. If that's the equivalent of buying like 12 coffees.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's interesting. I'll have to think about how I can turn those uses into something.
Yeah, like, if I guess it's like, because it's all about relating, right? To be like, hey, you clearly enjoy using my app. it would do me a solid if you paid for it, and then I could build another one for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's funny. That actually kind of leads into my rant, which is why does Apple promote certain apps in the App Store? I have been playing a game. I've been playing two different games that sometimes have advertisements right now, and one of the ads is for this cheesy game that looks kind of like, I think it's called like Gardenscapes. It looks kind of like a SimCity clone, but you're a gardener and there's a dog, and it looks like, one of those where the actual Sim City version of the game is just part of it, and then the rest is the classic like Candy Crush matching. And I've seen this ad come in fairly frequently on some of the apps I've been playing, like Full of Stars. And then today on the Mac App Store, that is the featured app. That is the app on the entire header. And it just made me wonder that why does Apple promote apps that clearly do not need the help? These apps, it'd be one thing if an app demonstrated a new piece of functionality, like 3D touch or something like that. But if failing that, why do they promote the apps that don't need the help? Like if one of those apps is from a major company and they spent like $1 million to build it and it's making hundreds of thousands of dollars a day, why does Apple give it even more of a boost? Shouldn't the whole point to be find those indie apps? Like you don't promote Call of Duty, you promote World of Goo.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I guess that what they would say is this is a popular app and they want to put that in front of people. But you're right, they've got this huge platform. There's millions of games. The games that are doing well should go to the back of the queue.
Yeah, I just mean like take Steam for example. The number of amazing games I find on Steam that I have never heard of before is frankly staggering. And they have a concept, if for those who aren't familiar with Steam, called your discovery queue, where if you pop into Steam, they'll compile a list of like 10 games that you can kind of give a plus or a minus to and say like, hey, I'm interested in this game or I'm not.
Mm,
And over time, based on the games currently in your Steam library and what you've looked at, it'll recommend new games. And it's a way, it's like, I guess it's like Genius, right? Like, except nobody uses Genius. But I've also just found that like, yes, if a major new game comes out, Steam will promote it, but I find so many indie games on Steam, and I find I do not get that same level of quality from the App Store's own promotions.
yeah, yeah, you're right. And there's so much room for improvement in how the App Store works in so many ways.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And we both know that even if I know there are third party sites out there that aggregate, and how many times do you find a good app because of Lifehacker or a personal recommendation? It would just be, I guess, like, yeah, it would just be kind of nice if Apple were kind of helping the person who needs the help and still has a good product.
yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Listen up, Apple. We need you. Get it together.
So I think this brings us to our point in the pod where we share our crazy app ideas.
Sure.
Lewis, what crazy app idea do you have from the deepest, darkest pits of your development mind?
Okay, well, the one that I have in mind is one that I actually tried to make like a few years ago, like a lot of years ago, but I still think it's a good idea. And maybe now that the world has moved on a bit, maybe now it would be more feasible than it was then. The scenario is you're at home with your partner, you decide you want to watch a movie, but what movie are you going to watch? It's difficult, perhaps, to choose on, to settle on one that you both like. Why can't technology take both of our interests and previous movie watching experience and suggest the perfect movie for us? Yeah, so that is my crazy app idea.
That's pretty good, actually. I just thought off the top of my head, Netflix, if Netflix had an accessible API, you have two user profiles, one for each partner, and if it could pick out a short list of movies that you are likely to enjoy but haven't watched yet, and you take the top 100 films from each person's Netflix profile, and you find the ones that match up, and then you randomly suggest one of those.
Yeah, exactly. It all seems very doable. Like for me, Netflix, or in the UK anyway, I think Netflix tends to be pretty rubbish for movies. Is the only problem.
Yeah, I mean, even in the States, because you have so many different licensing companies and everything, I feel like Netflix, its original content is obviously on point, right? And the television shows are just bananas. But yeah, on films, I don't know. I find myself more like I would pop over to iTunes for that. So maybe the couple movie picker could be like the show picker for Netflix, and then something else for movies.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The show picker would be just as good, actually.
So, my crazy app idea is actually a little crazy. It is a companion app for tracking stats in Settlers of Catan. So, I thought of this way before there was even an iPhone app for Settlers.
So I'm going to have to stop you, Nick. In case there's anyone else like me who doesn't know, give me a very brief overview of Settlers of Catan.
Oh, okay. Yes. So, it is one of those games that whenever someone describes it, it's a game that sounds very boring that's actually quite fun. And it is basically a game of resource management where you build a map, and the map is the island of Catan. And I realize, much like GIF, people will argue over whether it's Catan or Catan. And there was some Reddit AMA from years ago from the son of the game creator who said it's Catan, like katana, and everyone since in popular culture has said Catan, and I just can't do it. So send your hate mail. I will not say Catan.
Okay.
But anyways, so it's a game made up of hex tiles, and you dynamically build the game every time you play. So you get this wonderful random island of mixed resources, and the whole point is you are four different towns in the game, four different players, four different towns, and you basically just vie for resources to take over the island, and you have to do so through trade, a little bit of cooperation, a little bit of deceit, and it's just very deep and rich, but there's a lot going on. It's not as complicated as those multi-day games or the pandemic legacy style games that are destroyed over time or anything like that, but all of those legacy games basically at some point birthed from Catan.
Okay.
And so my crazy idea was basically a companion app to help you track stats and information in the game, because now, I honestly don't really remember even my original thought for this. Like, I don't know if I meant just, like, stats, like wins, losses, etc. But I actually think it's more like if you were trying to, like, win Cluedo, like, what resources you have, what's been spent, so that you could try to figure out what cards everyone has. And, maybe get having like a smart computer with you to help you gain an advantage.
So is it basically to help you cheat in your current game, or is it to track previous games, or maybe both?
I think the past version of me probably meant it to track game stats so that you could know wins, losses, maybe how many cards were drawn for each user, just for interesting purposes. The current me wants it for cheating.
Well, now you've said that publicly, that everyone's going to be very suspicious if you ever have your phone out while you're playing this game.
See, the problem is I'm already highly untrustworthy when it comes to Catan because, as several people have probably told everyone, I tend to rabble-rouse, and if someone starts to get a little ahead of everyone else, I will turn the crowd against them.
Right. Okay. Note to self.
Yeah. So it's best to either partner with me early or like avoid my wrath.
Okay. So you're either with you or against you, and you don't want to be against you. That's what we're saying here.
I mean, I take myself down plenty of times. It is not a foolproof strategy, but it is the court in which I have found myself.
Excellent. Okay, and that's our show.
The App Collective podcast is created by us, Nick and Lewis. Editing is done by me, so if you hate how the pod sounds, I have no one else to blame.
But if you like the pod, which I'm sure you do, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also find us on Twitter to share feedback and continue the conversation. Nick's at nsneebly, and I'm at Itinerant Dev, and the show's at Collective Co.
And finally, we would love it if you'd support us on Patreon. It's dangerous to go alone, and even $1 helps support us directly as app developers. There's loads of perks, and we've got a great Slack community to help discuss current and future apps. You can check everything out at podcast.appcollective.co. Awesome.